went surfing today, and he did. So good news, he went out. I thought maybe he was running a little late because he tried to surf the lane, which was pretty unsurfable.
No, I did not do that.
Now, when Matt Young says I'm not going out, you know it's probably not the day to hit the lane. But he did surf the hook for a couple hours.
Yeah, no, they almost didn't rent me a surfboard because they assumed that I would go get myself killed. But which I appreciated. I feel like I'm at a point in my life where I was talking to the guy at the shop, and I was like, "Good on you for like making sure that I don't do something really stupid." So
we like to check. It's a busy day for marine safety.
Yeah.
It's good that
Well, so then I just tried to. I've been to Santa Cruz a couple of times, but not a lot. So I just tried to drop every bit of Santa Cruz area knowledge that I had to be like, "Please give me a board," and eventually, so I'm here.
Excellent. We're glad you're here. And if you haven't read the book, it is fantastic. True story, and I'm going to tell it even though I told my friend I wouldn't. So I actually surf with some real surfers. Sarah Gerhardt is the first woman to surf Mavericks. She's a serious surfer. I just tag along and try to like play the part and stay out of her way. And she loaned me the book, and she said, "You got to read this book." I put it on my nightstand. I'm like what I understand from you. I'm a dumb, total kind of person. Start reading the book at 4:30 in the morning and dump an entire cup of coffee on said book. So then I had to do the walk of shame back with the book and was like, "I read it, I swear, there's coffee all over it." So now she's going to have you sign that.
Okay, good.
Obviously,
But this is weird because I'm going to spend a solid amount of time talking about a book that is not my book. But has anybody read a book called Ex Libris by Ann Fadiman? Anyone?
I love Ann Fadiman.
And yeah, she's great. And she wrote an essay about books and people who read and love books. So that's why I feel comfortable being like, all right, it's a tangent. And she talks about the difference between courtly lovers and carnal lovers of books. That like some people, right? You like. My wife is like this. Like if you dog-ear a page, it's like you like dog-eared a person. Like it's just not. Yeah. And I'm that totally out. Like to me, if a book has coffee on it, that's a sign that it was like read and enjoyed. So I take this as a compliment.
I definitely dog-eared the book. Seriously, dog-eared. So the book is about learning to surf. And as somebody who, I learned to surf as an adult. My kids don't remember learning how to surf, so they're like, "It's really not that hard, Mom. What's the problem?" And David in his book talks about if you learn after 14, you're never going to be good. It's just not going to happen for you. Give up now. But to me, it was about. It was really a book about surfing adjacently, but about getting along with folks who we maybe don't have as much in common with, and for the times right now, that's a pretty common theme. And more importantly, it was really about listening. To me, it was about truly listening. And I wonder, just in thinking about surfing as an activity, because it can be so humbling when you learn as an adult, and just that sense of what the ocean taught you about humility and humanity and listening and being a little bit out of control with where you are in the world.
So for me, and let me, I'm just going to do two quick shows of hands. So the first is how many people here surf? Okay, yeah, this is a California book talk. When the first couple book talks that I did when the book came out, they were in like DC and New Jersey. There's a couple people obviously in New Jersey who surf. DC, we were like very much at square one of like this is what the board looks like, that sort of thing. So and I'm always very intimidated when I talk about the book in California because I think it's almost certain that everyone in the audience is a better surfer than I am. So it's like it's interesting. But and then the other thing I was just going to ask to set expectations, and this is not a trick question, is how many people have read the book? Am I talking to people who have read it or people who have no idea where it comes from? So like somewhere around 50-50. Okay. So for me, this book started out, it was interesting. Like some nonfiction books, I think, you set out to write a book and memoir. This is my second memoir, and then I have another one that I'm working on. So my dad was like, "So you're going to write 3 memoirs by the time you're 40? I was like, "Yes," but I wouldn't have used that tone when I said it. But so some books about your own life, you say, okay, I'm going to set a goal because I want to write a book. This was almost the opposite. It was the only time in my life where I think I hit a low enough point that I was like, I need a hobby. And surfing sort of ended up being what I arrived at without meaning to, and it was really only 3 or 4 months in where I said, hey, I think this is actually a book. And I had made my wife promise me that I was like, I'm going to come to you at some point and say, I think there's a book here, and your job is to make sure that I don't write another book, because they take a lot of work. And eventually I wore her down. So that was, which I felt like was a good test of whether this was book worthy. But I think you talked about humility, and that was a big part of what made this feel like a book at first, was that for me a couple of things need to be happening for me to start to say, hey, I think this is a book. One is that I'm embarrassing myself, because that's always fun, because those stories are good stories. The other is that I'm learning something, because I think most books that I like in this kind of category of book tend to be about people changing and the author changing. And then the third thing is that the stuff I'm learning is stuff that other people could learn as well, or might be interested in learning from. And that's what started to happen. And so I do think that, it's interesting. You talk about what the ocean, I think the ocean is kind of exposure therapy for humility if you're an adult learner surfer. But I think the other thing is that I learned was dealing with this fear of embarrassment and feeling like, I think in my life there's a lot of things looking back on it where I feel like I haven't done that because I was worried about looking foolish, or I was worried about being really bad at it. And when I started surfing, it was very clear that being good at it, certainly at first, but kind of ever, depending on how you want to define it, was not an option. And so I think once I started to embrace that, right, to say, well, that's okay, I'm going to embarrass myself in public, and I'm going to enjoy it, or at least I'm going to accept it, I think that was really helpful, actually, in a way I never would have expected.
I love that. You should try mat surfing, because there's nothing more embarrassing than going out to the lane on a mat, which is, for those of you that don't know, an inflatable blow-up, like when you're little and you did it at the beach. And but I'm telling you, you may be the kookiest kook out there and look totally ridiculous, but you are having the most fun of anybody in the water, and it is always overhead on the mat. So it's really a good thing to try.
Okay. Next time I'm at you, do the otters steal those also?
Absolutely, without a doubt. The book, for those of you that haven't read it, is really, and I'll certainly let you talk about this, but to me, it struck me because it's about a journey that you went on with your brother-in-law, and that he was coming from a completely different place in terms of politics and culture, and maybe a little bit of even in temperament, just a different human from the way that you were, and probably the people that you were associating with in general. And having a son who grew up surfing here in Santa Cruz, and he grew up around a dining room table where there were tons of liberal political discussions. Imagine growing up the child of someone who's in office. You talk about D-style to abortion rights. And then he moved to Montana, and he surrounded himself with libertarians and came home and was like, I'm listening to Joe Rogan. This guy Joe Rogan is great. I was like, oh my God. I'll never run for office this time again. But that how do you find these ways to, whether it's through an activity or something, to find common ground in a moment like this?
So, Matt, my brother-in-law, it's not like we didn't get along exactly before we started surfing together. But I would say I always described it as sort of as like those YouTube videos where like a duck and a cat are friends, right? It's like sort of charming, but they're in the same space, but they don't speak the same, like they don't relate to each other in any way. And Matt and I are just really on almost every level different people. Matt is covered in tattoos. I think the last time I tried a temporary tattoo was like now almost 2 decades ago. Just at that level of commitment, it's like days where you're like, what if that was a mistake? Yeah, and so Matt listens to death metal, and I listen to Stephen Sondheim. And when the book came out, I asked Matt, because this had come up, what's your favorite song? Somebody had asked me, and I was like, all right, I'll ask Matt. And he said, I think it was called, not Savor, but it was like Surrender the Stillborn, or something like that. And I was like, you're fucking with me. And he was like, no, it's great. And then I listened to it, and he thinks it's great. And then, a lot of those things, And also, I will say, like, so he's an electrician, so if I tried to do his job, I would die. You know, and I think those divides were always there. They didn't mean that much. And then at a certain time, and then I think it sort of got turbocharged by the pandemic, all of these same divisions became the ones that are also these fault lines in our country, right? The question of, do you have a college degree or not? Do you work with your hands or do you work in front of a screen? Do you listen to Joe Rogan, or are you not a Joe Rogan type, right? Like, all of these things ended up being, these dividers in a divided country. And for me, I thought initially when we started surfing together that by the end, if either we would be like, all right, we don't really like each other very much, or we would be like, we do like each other and we agree on a lot, and by that I meant he would agree with me on a lot. And neither of those things happened. I think what is really interesting, and to me what the story kind of ended up being about, was that the heart of this unlikely friendship between us is that we still don't see the world in the same way all that often, and yet it turned out our differences didn't mean as much as we thought. And that, I think, was something that I wouldn't have found, certainly without surfing, and it's also something that I feel like for non-surfers has been really gratifying when people have read the book and said, oh, I have someone in my life where we just don't know how to talk to each other anymore, and maybe, even if it's not like, great, we're going to paddle out someplace, but just that idea of maybe there's still hope, and it doesn't mean that we have to see eye to eye, even on big stuff, things that I might even consider like moral questions.
I'd love to talk more about that, because you mentioned in the book, and really COVID brought a lot of people to surfing, and as we've seen in Santa Cruz, and it also brought out these divides that you perhaps didn't even know, and even that talk about, where you really cut yourself off from the vaxxer, anti-vaxxer, the master, the anti-master, and we created, where there was already a political divide, some serious divisions in our country. And now we've gotten to a point where it's gone so extreme that we've upended our health department. We have, in a lot of ways, a country where there's so many people that are denying science even exists in some respects. But how do we, I don't know that we can walk that back, but how do we get to a point where we start having these conversations again? Because it can't just be the division is so deep, but we need to move forward. And I think, especially in these tough times, we're finding we've got to find some common ground.
Yeah, well, I guess let me start by saying something that I learned from being someone who started surfing at 35. And are there any adult learner surfers here, or am I the only one? Okay, there's like 3 people brave enough to admit it. And I don't know if the 3 of you have had this experience, but for me, I'm like, the moment you start to follow a couple of surfers on Instagram, your feed is flooded with like surf experts, right? And like people who are like, here's what you got to do to master your pop-up, or like 10 stretches or whatever, and you have no idea who to trust, and you follow some, if you're me, very strange people down some very not terribly authoritative rabbit holes, and it gave me so much more empathy for what people deal with in a lot of other contexts, right? It's not saying, I don't want both sides of this. Like, I got vaccinated, and I think it was the right choice, and Matt didn't get vaccinated, and I would happily tell him I don't think that was the right choice. But it doesn't mean that, but I feel like I have a lot more of a sense of like, oh yeah, when you're just like, the internet is out there, and social media is there, I'm gonna try to figure out the truth, and I'm starting from a place of like beginning this stuff, it's really hard. That said, I think, to me, the one of the things I learned from the experience of writing the book and talking to people, it's funny, when you write a nonfiction book, I always find you're signing yourself up to hear everybody's version of the same anecdote. So like, my first book was about all the times I embarrassed myself in front of President Obama, and basically I signed up to hear anytime anyone had ever met President Obama, they would tell me about that. Which was great, for what it's worth. And in this case, I feel like there's kind of 2. It's like, has anyone ever taken a surf lesson? They're going to tell me. And then also, this isn't like me prompting you all. You're welcome to, but you don't have to after what I'm talking. But the other I've heard a lot of people tell me about friends or family members where they're on, especially around vaccines, we're on the opposite side of these divides. And I think the thing that I've learned is it's really important to respect every person, and that's different than respecting every opinion. And I think if you are able to have that kind of baseline sort of foundation and share experiences and time with someone else, then it gives you the space to have conversations where you say, I don't think so, right? Like, and you don't have to say, oh well, every opinion is equally valid, because they're not. My opinions on a lot of things, as my wife would point out were she here, are not as valid as somebody who knows what they're talking about. But I do think that that baseline level of respect, and something that's really interesting to me, so the book kind of covers up through about November 2023, and it doesn't cover the 2024 election or anything leading up to that, but I have found that since I was done writing and since those experiences were finished, Matt and I are just a lot more able to talk about, not just able, but kind of eager to talk about things even when I know we disagree, because I'm just curious, right? And I think that's I think curiosity, and not to debate, not to persuade, not to be like, by the way, you're totally wrong, but just to say, what do you think, because I want to know what you think. I think that's it's not enough to change everything, but I think it's the sort of necessary condition to change anything.
I love that. I think it goes back to that listening, that we need to start listening to each other. I think we're so quick to voice our opinion and go straight for, well, you're wrong, and that doesn't create conversation or any ability to find common ground. It's even that, how do we both washed the dishes today. Like, what is the one point that we can actually agree on? Like, oh, we did the same thing. Isn't that amazing? You don't have to go find surfing. But how do we do that in a moment where, I think you mentioned social media. I mean, people live and breathe their social media feeds. And you started getting interested in surfing, and all of a sudden your feed gets full. And I watch that with my kids. I worry about that terribly, that your feed and what you're paying attention to, and if you're not, even if the news was unopinionated and just giving us the news, you still don't know where people are hearing those things. So how do we do that in a time when social media feeds are so full of that, and finding those common ground?
That's a good question. If I knew that, no, I guess what I would say, a couple of things that might at least begin to answer elements of that question. One of them is, I do think that I've become a real believer in things that force you to not look at your phone. Not at all something I thought about when I started surfing, now if I'm in DC, I'll swim laps at the pool near our house or whatever. But something where your phone will explode if you took it with you is I think that should be almost a requirement for hobbies. And I say this as somebody, because otherwise I'm going to look at my phone, right? Like, even now I'm like, what's on my phone, right? It's impossible not to. They're addictive. So I think that's part of it. I think the other thing, I think on one hand we're all, or many of us, are sort of more online than we want to be, or learning more through our social media feed. On the other hand, I think for the same reason, many of us are really craving something different. One of the things I feel with social media is very few people seem that happy about it, and it's weirdly a common thread, right? This sense of, we don't love learning about each other from the internet, because nobody's the best version of themselves on the internet, and definitely no one's the full version of themselves on the internet. So I do think that there is a kind of hunger for experiences, and I think they can be, as you said, the dishes, right? It doesn't have to be like we go climb Everest together. And I think that, and some of it is also just noticing when those things happen, and thinking about them as important. Because I think the other thing, because we're living in a very high stakes moment for the country, for the world, it can be very easy to say, none of those little things matter. The stakes are too high to focus on anything small. But I think if we exclusively focus on small things, that's bad too. But I think that can be a trap, where we stop noticing the little stuff, and so we don't see a way forward. And I think that's the other piece of this. Sometimes, a lot of the time, I'm like, was it really worth all the time, right? That I have friends who are running for office or doing, like making the world better as a full-time job, and I would they'd be like, "What are you up to?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm really, I'm hoping that I can, maybe eventually get to the point where I can do a cutback." And it doesn't sound great. And I think there is something that's a little escapist about it, but I also think that there's trying to appreciate those little things and thinking about their relationship to big things is something that we can't lose sight of just because the stakes are so high.
They are. We used to have a group of girlfriends would say, let's do a week of truth on Facebook where you actually show what's happening, like the kids screaming, and I cheated on my test, and people are fighting, instead of all the, you look at social media and everybody's either perfect or not, they're perfect.
Yes, I assume they weren't running for any political office.
Absolutely. Absolutely not, never win. So, I wondered throughout the book, and I had a conversation, my colleague Jenny this afternoon about, did your brother-in-law read the book before you put it out there? Because there was a lot of moments where I thought, gosh, this would be really hard to read about myself or someone writing this about me, especially someone that I presume you care about.
Yeah, he didn't. So I.
We still talk.
We do. And it's funny because if it were what you said, right, where you're like. I have not been written about very much, but some of my colleagues at the White House wrote books just like a lot of people at the White House do, and they would say things like, like I think, like David was in the office and he was like worked hard, and be like, what does that mean? Like I was like, I want control, right? Like I was very much, so the idea of somebody writing a book about me and someone, but I'm not getting to write it, that would freak me out. So I talked to Matt a bunch of times because he knew I was writing a book about this, and I said, if you want to read it beforehand, let me know, and I'll that way you can just let me know if there's anything that you won't want in there. And he's like, yeah. And I was like, okay, that good to know. And I was like, are you sure? And he was like, yeah, if I'm an asshole, just say I'm an asshole. And I was like, first of all, he's not an asshole, and saying, well, I wouldn't have said that even if you were, because I would like to get invited to Thanksgiving. But it was like the number of dimensions on which the two of us are just not very alike is large. So I did have my wife, who's his older sister. She did like a quick read beforehand, and there were only one or two things where she was like, nah, I think you should take that out. And then the other thing. So after the book was done, but it wasn't out yet, it was just, you couldn't change it, Matt was like, actually, maybe I do want to read it. And I was like, oh, crap. Yeah. So he was working on a house in Asbury Park, where we live, and so I drove over, and it was like in this sort of, like, it was in a totally empty, like a house that was being flipped, like the kind of house where if you're going to murder your brother-in-law, you could bury him in a crawl space easily. And so I gave him the galley of the book, a little paperback advance copy. And I just remember that was by far the scariest, review I was going to get. But he was reading through the table of contents, and he just started laughing. And I was like, okay, we're going to be all right. And I think there was. I think he also really, and I guess you'd have to ask him, but or I could ask him, but I think this is true. I think he also was like, it hadn't hit him that the idea that like our story was going to be written down before then, right? He knew that, but it's different to know it and to see it. And I think there's something cool about that, even if it's also scary. The thing we really disagreed on, there was one thing, which was that he was like pretty sure that when we rented a minivan here, on our trip here, that I scraped it up, and I explained to him that according to the book, that definitely did not happen. So that is one area of contention. But other than that, we're good.
There's so many things I loved about the book. It was this perfect intersection of there, aside from New Jersey, where I've never served, I served all the places that you'd served, and then you talked quite a bit about politics, which this week was, election day is like my Super Bowl. And I was struck because at some point in the book, you sort of offhandedly mentioned that you thought about running for office. And you talked about it in the way somebody who's really thinking about running for office, like I'm gonna go and see if I can find money, and I'm gonna move to the district and do all the stuff. And then you kind of dropped it and were like, oh no, I'm not done, I'm not doing it. And I wondered about that in the, what really shifted for you in that moment, and have you thought about it since? And certainly you worked in the White House, you've seen the mechanics of politics, and do you want to run for office, or is that something you think about?
Well, it's interesting. I think because I worked in the White House, and then at this point, there's a piece that that should be, I don't know, I feel like now I'm jinxing it, but there's a piece I'm writing that's going to be in the New York Times tomorrow about thinking about the Obama presidency as history and how old that makes me feel, even though I'm 39, right? I also feel like I'm from history somehow. Yeah, it's weird. I was talking to a college students a couple of years ago, and I was telling them kind of my origin story. They were like, how did you end up working in the White House? I was like, oh, it was 2008. I saw Obama speak. I was totally inspired. I moved to Ohio, worked on his campaign, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, you guys probably don't remember all that super well. And one of them raised their hand, and then without being called on, was like, we were literal babies, right? I just had this moment of oh, okay, basically, I could be wearing a powdered wig at this point. And so, but one of the things that amount of time has done is it makes, I have a lot of friends who have run, some of them have won, some of them haven't, but all of them, you start to be like, oh, this is a thing people I know do. And I think that in a lot of parts of life, right, you're just one of the threshold things for many of us is just being like, do people like me do that? And so I was thinking a little bit about it, but one of the things I think that it's not one of the main parts of this book, but I do think that I think it's one of the main things about me that has changed, was my relationship to achieving stuff or trying to achieve stuff changed. Early in the book, I say that Matt surfs just because he likes it, and I didn't understand that at all. Right? I was like, no, you do things to get better at them and to accomplish stuff, and I didn't fully appreciate how much I think I had become a little bit of a success monster. And I think Andy Kim, who's now a senator from New Jersey, but he was in Congress, he left to run for Senate, and I know him a little bit. I'm always I always feel like there's people who are, if somebody does very well, they're like, now we're friends. But Andy and I know each other, and I admire him a lot. And so I thought maybe, there's an open district near our house. I think what he did is really cool. Maybe I could do something like that. But I think part of what I did and would not have done when I was a little bit younger and maybe before surfing was take the time to interrogate myself a little bit and say, is this really something that I think that I would be uniquely suited to do and actually want to do? Or is this saying, this is the next accomplishment, right? Is this kind of the next level? And I think in this case, it was the next level. So I don't know. I think I like the idea of demystifying running for office, right? So it's certainly something I would think about if it was the right moment or the right time or so on. But it's also not something where I feel desperately that I need to do this in order to, be happy, or I don't even know.
Doesn't make you happy.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't even know. Maybe you can tell me, but but I feel like there's, in Washington, there's people where it's if they don't run, if they're not running and winning, they'll cease to exist, or at least they think they'll cease to exist. And I feel more confident than I've ever felt that no matter the sort of field, that I'm not going to be like that, which is, that's not a resume. By definition, you can't put that on a resume and be self-knowledge, right? That would be weird. But it is a nice feeling.
I as someone who decided to run for office after Obama's first election, I was like, hope and change, and it's going to be me, and I'm going to make a difference, and I really believed in it, and I still believe in it, but yet I watched my children not believe in it, and they're the ones who grew up sort of, and my daughter said, I never thought after growing up with Obama as my president, or as she identifies as president, that my first time I'd vote, I'd have Donald Trump on the ballot. And the feeling of just complete detachment from politics and disinterest in the political sphere, and that public service is no longer something that our youth will want to do. And I worry very much about that without these sort of transformational politicians that really inspire us, and in one way or another, I'm sure the current president has inspired a lot of people, but I don't think that's making our youth inspired to run for office. And I don't know, do you have any thoughts about, how we, someone who lives and breathes politics on the East Coast and near DC, how do we make that shift?
I feel like this conversation has been the most unanswerable number of unanswerable questions I've gotten about this book.
You want to talk surfing?
Yeah.
Come back.
Like, you want to talk about a wave pool versus the ocean?
You're in a room with surfers. You might want to be careful of answering questions. I'm trying to help you.
Let's just talk about.
I know the skills of these people.
Let's talk about easy stuff like national unity.
Everything is soft.
I think that, so obviously I don't fully know the answer to that. I don't think any of us do. But I do think that one of the things that gives me a little bit of hope, strangely, is that I also remember what it's like to be a young person disillusioned with politics, right? Like, I knocked on doors for John Kerry. That was the first person I voted for, and then he lost. And then I was like, in my first book, it wasn't that he lost, which I was obviously disappointed by, but I described that campaign as it felt like he didn't fully believe what he was saying. That it felt like watching someone try to tell you that the best Beatle is Ringo, right? Why are you saying this? This doesn't feel like it's coming. Really is truly what you believe. And no offense to Ringo. And so and then I saw Obama, and I was like too cool for, I quit the college Democrats and whatever, and I was like, all right, I'm gonna do comedy stuff, and more like from a perspective, it was more fun to make fun of things than to do things. And then I saw Obama speak, and in the way you kind of can when you're 21, immediately changed my personality, and it was like, now I'm the Obama guy, and I'm going to email all my friends and tell them what Obama's up to today, as though they couldn't find that out if they were interested. And I do think these things change quickly, especially for young people. And I think the thing that I worry about most is that we're going to look at all of the divisions and all of the social media stuff and all of the people, frankly, who, and this is not just a conservative thing, there's plenty of progressives who I think get attention by being outrageous for its own sake, and say it's almost like obsolete or old-fashioned to try to think about how we can actually be bigger than all of this. And the thing that I just that made me fall in love with Barack Obama was this sense of, not at him, it was like us, right? It was that I remember being at Obama rallies and feeling like, okay, he's a great speaker, obviously, but looking around the audience and thinking that's what feels so special, the sense that we're capable of so much more than we thought. And I think that's a really hard thing to summon, but I certainly think that it's worth trying. I also suspect that whoever tries will get a lot of credit from voters. I think actually, and obviously, different people are going to have different takes on this, I think this election just this week was almost the reverse of that. I think you saw a lot of people, for example, in New Jersey, where everyone thought that the election was going to be a lot closer than it was. I think there was a backlash to the kind of constant us versus them of the current administration, right? And it wasn't so much policy related, although there was certainly some of it, but there was also just this sense of we don't like this feeling of constantly being pitted against each other, and we, electing a governor is not single-handedly going to fix that, but it was registering a sense of this is not what we really want out of our politics.
Agree. All right, surf question. You surf the Waco wave pool. I haven't surfed there, but I have surfed the surf ranch. It was hands down the scariest place I've ever surfed because you don't get to spot the wave. All of a sudden there's this noise and people are like, go, go, go. Like, where am I going? Into the fence? To the fence?
Right.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about favorite spots to surf and what is on your surf trip list next.
Well, honestly, and I'm not just saying it because I'm here, Santa Cruz has always been one of my favorite places that we've been, because I do feel like in New Jersey, it's funny to be in California. Sometimes I'm like anybody who likes their waves, you don't want to talk about them too much because you don't want people to show up. But then I feel like when I'm in California, there's just no danger of that. So, and so I do think that in Jersey we have good waves, especially when the hurricanes are in the right spot. But the waves are really steep, right? Like much steeper, and definitely when you're learning, there's no place to learn. It's just all kind of the same, and it's all pretty steep. And so I remember the first time I was here with Matt, and someone was like, "Oh, that's a longboard wave," and I was like, "What?" Right? Like that. The idea that there's a wave that you could like go to, and then there's a harder, more challenging wave somewhere else. Like that was mind blowing. And so the length. You can the length of a ride is much longer here. So I'm a fan. I also I will say Waco was really and wave pools in general I feel like were really helpful for me for learning, right? Where you get reps in a way you just can't in the ocean, or at least there's not as many different things. In terms of bucket list stuff, weirdly, so Matt and I were planning to go to Ireland, and then we totally stormed out, and so we ended up, Jackie and I had planned a romantic vacation to the Basque Country in Spain and France, and I just kind of took that itinerary and changed it up a bit into a surf trip at the last minute, and so Matt and I went there, which was an interesting conversation to have. But I think Ireland would be a good, and it's also Ireland's not that far from the East Coast. I do feel like talking to people here, it's like that's like going to Japan or something. But
we do have a World Surfer Reserve in Ireland now.
Really?
North Devon, I think. Someone fact check me on that. It's cold, but
yeah,
it's cold here.
Yeah.
I mean, who are we kidding? It's cold here.
Well, and I will say that's the one. It was something about New Jersey originally, right? The first time I really started talking to Matt about surfing was in the winter, just coincidentally, and so he, it was around Christmas, and he'd show up, and he was like, "I've been out surfing," and I was like, "Are you sure? Because it's freezing out, 30 degrees outside and 35 in the water." And I do think that does help. It keeps things uncrowded in the winter in a nice way, and then it kind of opens up a whole.
Not here, buddy. Not here. Let me tell you. Try being a goofy foot surfer in Santa Cruz. It's not easy either. So you've written 3 books.
Yes.
And now you're writing a movie about elves and Santa, and I didn't catch that as you were walking in, but I'm curious about what's next.
So the Christmas movie, I wrote a script, and then that was he did a Hollywood thing where got set up with a producer and whatever, and then kind of died on the vine after the writer's strike, and hopefully it'll come back because I still like the idea of it. And then I am in theater. So this was this book, and I was very lucky. My editor is great, and he had signed me to a 2-book deal, and it was write this book and then do something cool and write about it. And so if you're a writer in this genre, you're like, oh, that's the dream. No way I won't be able to think of something cool by the time this book has been out for several months. And here we are. And so I'm if anyone has a good idea for a book, I'm all ears. So I'm working with him now to figure out what that's going to be, and we'll see. But
I love it. You said there's a potential for Surfer Magazine, and as someone who is I love surfing, but non-professional surfer, clearly. I got quoted in Surfer once about surfonomics, and I'm like, that's about as close as I'm going to get to Surfer Magazine.
Yes.
So here you are. You're going to be learning to surf as an adult and surf magazine.
Well, and they excerpted the book for Surfer Magazine, and so I did feel like very cool. I was like, yeah, I've been in Surfer Magazine.
Surfer.
I'm not in some, like, for what? I'm like, don't worry about it.
Yeah. That cutback.
Yeah,
was
exactly.
Amazing.
Yeah.
It was amazing.
Yeah, I had my picture on Surfer.
I have my name, but I'll take it. I'll take it. So I do want to open it up for questions and answers, but the one thing I do want to tell you, David, is so in my world right now, nonprofits it's brutal out there. It's not an easy time. And so now my new mantra around the office is, it's only drowning, it's fine, it's only drowning. So it's become the new motto of the community.
I'm not glad to hear that, but given the circumstances.
We've got it. Other questions?
Yeah, you've touched on a little bit about your getting involved in the Obama campaign, and now your resume is repetitive that you are a former speechwriter. Can you fill the gaps how Obama allowed you to be so important so quickly?
Can everybody hear that question? Okay.
I like that question because it was falsely flattering. So I kind of like I caught the Obama bug in 2008. We talked about that, and then I moved to DC after the campaign, basically just hoping change. That was the plan. Thought I was going to do healthcare policy. I would have been terrible at doing healthcare policy or policy of any kind. Jackie, my wife, does policy and also and Bree's parents are over there. Her colleague on the House Judiciary Committee and also a friend of ours. And so I talked to policy people, and I'm like, thank goodness I never got a job doing policy, because they're very detail oriented. And the last time I was talking at the book, I forgot shoes, and so I had to explain that like policy people don't forget they don't show up in flip flops because they forgot their real shoes. So I ended up getting an internship at a speechwriting firm, which I did not know existed, and that happened through a friend of a friend, and then that turned into a job 2 years later at the White House, writing for the senior staff. And basically, I met with, I was going to leave for Chicago and work on the re-election campaign. I feel like I'm now doing like the very long version, but I'll try to keep it short.
So that's 4 years later.
Yeah, 2 years later. And one of the things about because Obama was young when he ran, and because everybody who was more established, and this kind of goes to what you're talking about in terms of like this sense of like young people suddenly becoming animated by politics. A lot of the people who had been in politics for a while on the staff side worked for Hillary, and so there were the staff skewed a lot younger than a typical presidential administration. And so I was going to go to Chicago and just open boxes in the offices of the re-election campaign until they hired me to do something. That was my plan. And my bosses were like, that doesn't sound like a very good plan. Would you like us to introduce you to some people so you at least know who to talk to when you get there? And they introduced me to John Favreau, who was the chief speechwriter for Obama at the time. And he was like, well, one of Valerie Jarrett, who's a senior advisor to the president, she's been looking for speechwriters. She can't find anybody. Nothing's worked out. So if you wanted to stay here and apply for that job, you'd be the only person applying. And I was like, yeah, okay, I'll do that. So I had sublet out my room, and I double-crossed the person who I'd sublet my room to, and stayed in my room. And I worked for Valerie for about a year, and then I moved over to the campaign, and then over to the president's team.
Thank you.
Neil?
So most of us in here, the folks that surf in here, have a home break. Would yours be Manasquan, New Jersey?
No, so for me, it's still, my heart belongs to the Asbury Park Dog Beach. And don't laugh, people. So that's where.
Dog Beach.
Yeah. So in New Jersey, the beaches, most towns, they have like one designated surf beach in the summers, and then out of the season you can go wherever you want. So in Asbury, when I started learning the summer in Asbury, our surf beach is the Dog Beach, and so that's still where I tend to go. Sometimes I'll go to Deal, which is a couple beaches over. Manasquan's probably the most like locally famous of the breaks in the area, but for the same reason, it's the only one that gets super crowded. And so now there's a couple of spots that Matt and I will go to that people don't seem to have figured out to go to yet, which is good.
You talked at the beginning about how you didn't go into the conversations with your brother-in-law trying to change his mind. And I wonder if you might be able to just talk about that a little bit, because I think most of us, when we go in, the conversation with something's different, like that's the intention of how that was for you. And was that always, or did you did that shift? And did you change your mind on anything?
Yeah, I think the question was about sort of, let me see if I kind of get this right, that it was about this idea of going into conversations with someone not trying to change their mind and how that came about. And I would say, I'm not necessarily proud to admit this, I think originally I was kind of like, well, what I'm going to say makes so much sense that I'll just say what I think, and then someone will be like, of course, right? Like, and I think that turns out not to be the case. But I think that's something that changed for me over the course of the book and the last couple of years. And it doesn't, and what I found really challenging is you have to be able to hold on to what you believe and feel very strongly about, even as you recognize that people feel really differently. And I've thought about, and it's not just Matt, right? Like, this is, just in case we haven't gotten into enough heavy stuff, during, like, shortly after October 7th, there were people who I worked with, so a couple of people who I worked with in the Obama administration, and who posted some stuff that I just thought was like, not a matter of opinion, as a matter of fact, pretty wildly inaccurate. And I remember being like, do I talk to them about it? Should I be like, no, I'm done with this person, we can't be friends? And it was because of this experience with Matt that I was like, I think we should be able to talk. And we still don't agree on a lot of stuff, but we should be able to talk about it. And I think that is, it's interesting. It's something that I think President Obama also talks about these days, less with the surfing, but still. But this idea that, like, if you're going to solve these problems, you have to do it with people who disagree with you on a lot of stuff. And that's really hard. And one of the things that I also will say that has made all this harder is we have the option now of just saying, I'm only going to surround myself with people who agree with me. Or I'm just going to go online where the algorithm is mostly either going to show me people that I hate and make me really mad, or they're going to show me people who tell me I'm right about everything and make me feel really good, but I don't have to deal with people in my life who see things really differently and like make me mad, but I also like, right, that's too complicated, I don't have to do it. And so I think that but the other thing that I've found is that, and it helps, right, we'll say it helped that I started off thinking about this as a writer, even though now I don't write about me and Matt, that it helps to start off just being curious, right, to say, like, I think that's interesting, even if I'm not, I don't want to change your mind, but I do have a goal, which is to find out why you think what you think. And you asked whether Matt changed my mind on anything. There's a couple of things, some of them less serious, but one that is kind of political. I remember kind of early in New Jersey, we have a rule that they banned plastic bags, and so you need the reusable bags, and Matt was complaining that basically you end up buying all these reusable bags, each of them has like 20 bags worth of plastic in it, and we have so many reusable bags. And at the time, I kind of dismissed it because I was like, I bet you heard that on Joe Rogan or something. And the more I thought about it, that's one where I'm like, yeah, I think he's right about that. Like, this, I'm sure you were hoping to hear about what my thoughts were on plastic bag policy, but in DC we have like a 5-cent bag tax, and that's worked really well, but you can get a bag if you need one. And I'm just like, that would make a lot more sense than what we have in Jersey. And I wouldn't have thought about it if he hadn't mentioned it, right? And he probably wouldn't have mentioned it if it hadn't been probably on Rogan.
In the back.
Yeah, a couple of times you both talked about, like, it doesn't have to be surfing, it could be something else. I'm just curious, like, surfing is, when you're in the ocean, you're exposed to this grandeur and these, like, natural cycles, tides, swell, it's conditional. Do you think there's something about being in that space with somebody else that kind of facilitates this humility that creates discourse, maybe? I don't know. That could be too woo-woo, but
No,
it's the right place for it.
Yeah. No, I think, yeah, I feel like if I was like, nah, surfing's stupid, that would be a turn. But I do agree with what you're saying. I think that, I think there's something about surfing also that everybody is chasing this thing, like a feeling that you can't access on land, physically as well as emotionally, right? Like, you know, there was a lot of stuff that got cut from this book. I turned in a draft of the book that would have been like probably 200 pages longer, and most of them were not good. But my editor had to be like, do we really need so much about like board shapes, right? Like, can we take out all the board talk? But one of the things that I wrote about and ended up taking out, but I do think a lot about is like wave energy is just not something that I think I have sense about it in there now, but wave energy is just not something that we deal with in most of our lives. So anybody, you know, when I was out today, right, like there were a lot of people out who were substantially better at me in the water. There were a couple of people who seemed like they were, you know, kind of just starting out, but all of us are trying to kind of tap into this force that we could never see anywhere else. And so there's something, it's not just unifying, but it kind of puts us all on the same plane that has nothing to do with the rest of the world. And it does, I mean, I'm sure people here would know sort of what I'm talking about, or I don't know how you all would describe it, but for me it always feels like this kind of door to Narnia opening when you're on a wave and then it closes and you're like, ooh, how do I get back to Narnia, right? Like, and so I do think it's really helpful in that way. I don't think surfing is the only way to kind of build those connections, but it certainly is it's a good one. And I think that sense of taking things that take you out of yourself can be a good start at a moment when we're so aware of all that we don't have in common.
I knew you'd have a question, Tyler.
Oh my God.
The Narnia question.
First off, Kyle Sherman says hello, good buddy of mine. And second off, how long are you here for? And would you like a free surf coaching session with myself?
These are,
I haven't read the book yet, but I would think
yeah. Can I say that's a much better question than how do we bring the country together?
Leave it to Tyler Fox.
Yeah.
These are Mavericks. Be careful what you
Okay,
wish
yeah,
for.
maybe not there.
With drop it.
Yeah, so I will say actually, the other reason they ranked me board was because I dropped Kyle's name. That was helpful.
There you go.
I think they were like, okay, he knows enough people that probably he's not just gonna like, you know, grab a board and head out to Steamer Lane or something. And leaving,
You can still sit
yeah.
where you surf though.
Oh, so I paddled up the hook,
At the hook.
and then ended up at Sharks and Privates, and then walked my way back. And the thing that I will say is just different, you know, and this was true when I was in Hawaii too, is just like, it was frustrating because I was like, I think I could surf some of the bigger set waves at the hook today, which I understand, you know, for some people it would mean a lot, for some people it's like, sure. But then there's just so many people in a way that, and like so many of them know what they're doing. Where in Jersey, there's a lot more people like me who picked up a board during the pandemic, and so you know, it's like a people, man.
Yeah.
And I would love a surf lesson the next time I'm here, so I will definitely take you up on that. I have to leave at 8. My flight's at 8:30. Shut down nonsense pending. So I will be at the airport tomorrow early. We'll see where I end up.
All right.
But yeah.
In check.
Yes, but thank you.
Yeah.
If anyone else would like to offer me anything now.
You haven't solved the problems of the country yet.
No,
So
that's
just
true.
Take a
Yeah.
beat. One more question. Time for one more question. Yeah.
I'm curious, what are, in surfing there's a lot of known unknowns, and there's a lot of unknown unknowns for somebody who's new to it. I'm curious, what were the biggest unknown skills you had to learn as an adult learner surfer?
So I think you're probably overrating the number of known unknowns for someone learning as an adult. I think the thing that I'm because it's kind of, yeah, I was going to sort of say all of it, but I think the thing that surprised me the most was how much fear was like how much surfing changed my relationship with fear, and how much dealing with fear was a skill that both could be learned or could be thought about and improved, and how important that was. I didn't, and that's, so for example, like I have, like at different times, I picked up running. I went through like a chess phase briefly, right? Like I've done other hobbies. They're not terrifying, and I am a skier. Like I've been skiing since I was 6, so that I kind of grew up with, and that can be scary, but it's a different kind of scary. And so my analogy in my mind was to skiing, but I didn't think about the possibility that like if every ski run started with an avalanche, right? And so that really surprised me a lot. And I think it also, and I didn't know this would be the case at the time, but it's one of the things that has kind of taken where I was like, oh, this is also something that I am learning that is helping me live more fully, period, not just in the water, right? Like, so one of my first surf lessons, I was with my instructor with the book I call Katie, and I said, Katie, I've noticed there's this feeling of like the wave is going to break on top of me and, kill me. Any thoughts? Like, how do I avoid that? And she was like, oh, that's the flower of fear. I was like, what's that? And she said, well, the flower of fear is this idea that when you feel this sense of like abject terror, like you're going to die, that means you're in the right spot. And I remember thinking, okay, this sounds like something, crazy people would say. And so it took me a while, but I think over time now, like I thought about this even, I think about it a lot now with some of the stuff going on in the world and in the country, right? Like there's just a lot of scary stuff going on, and sometimes it's scary and you want to get the heck out of there. But sometimes I find myself saying, this is frightening, but actually this is the flower of fear, right? The fear is telling me that this is important and I'm actually right where I should be. And that, I think, is something that I never imagined I would pick up from surfing, but I'm really glad that I did.
It's like every single time I follow Sarah Gerhardt in the water. The flower of fear. I'm going to die. And yet, it's just...
You haven't yet?
I haven't yet, and
so
it's...
far, 100% of the time,
100%, no death. We're still here. Well, thank you, David. This has been fantastic.
Thank you both. That was really a fantastic conversation. I will never, ever, ever surf. I know I'm in the minority in this room.
Clowns and drowning.
I was telling Hillary I think I was drowned by a clown in a past life because I was super scared of both. But I do rock climb, so I can really. It's a similar thing. You're getting over that fear and hanging on, and it does carry over to the rest of life. So.